We saw a big shift in subject matter for this week's readings, and because of that, I'm going to treat them a little more informally in my discussion. Let's start out looking at the national and state of Kentucky curriculum standards for language and literature education together, since they contain a lot of overlapping material, then go on to compare them with Stephen Ellenwood's emphasis on character education. The Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts are part of the larger Common Core Standards Initiative that was begun in 2009 by the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. The standards are meant, in their own words, to help ensure that all students are college and career ready in literacy no later than the end of high school. In other words, we need to first recognize that these standards are very policy-oriented. They fundamentally imagine the role of education to be the development of productive citizens, that is to say, students who will participate in and add social and economic value to the society at large. There are numerous implications for applying that policy orientation towards something as complex as literature. If we skip ahead to the 6th through 12th grade college and career readiness anchor standards for reading, for example, we are assured in a sidebar that students must grapple with works of exceptional craft and thought, which will offer profound insights into the human condition. But in the very next sentence, the note on content specifies that these texts should be chosen from among seminal U.S. documents, the classics of American literature, and the timeless dramas of Shakespeare. The patriotic focus on American works should not be surprising, especially when we remember the ultimately pragmatic underpinnings of this project combined with the time constraints of middle and high school teachers. But to sandwich all of the classics of American literature between the preamble, the Declaration of Independence, and the timeless dramas of Shakespeare really drives home how socially conservative the assumptions of this document are, which may well explain why this statement was sequestered in a sidebar. Looking at the 10 anchor standards themselves, we can pretty easily see how they were grouped together. The first 3 require students to be able to think about literary content. The second group of 3 focus on form, and the last 3 address intertextuality. The 10th point, about range of reading and text complexity, point towards both the aforementioned sidebar and the subsequent sample canon, which we will discuss shortly. But it is the first 9 points that directly structure the extensive grid of the reading standards which follow, and it is worth our while to scrutinize those. While the tight grid-like structure of the standards works to give them an official appearance of rationality and solidity, they are fraught with ambiguities. Consider just the second bullet point, determine a theme or central idea of a text. On the one hand, anyone who's read much fiction will understand what is being asked for here, but on the other hand, the standard thus established cannot recognize the complex, often contradictory ways in which multiple themes and ideas interact with one another. And we might well be reminded here of Wolfgang Iser's assertion that the fictive is itself a crossing and recrossing of boundaries. Indeed, if we recall that for Iser linguistic combination was an integral part of fictionalizing acts, we might well be surprised to see the heavy gray bar that separates themes and ideas from determining the meaning of words and phrases, implying as it does that interpretation happens independent of ideation. However, if we jump ahead to texts illustrating complexity, quality, and range, one sees a real attempt to mirror the diversity of the American population, with many women and minority writers represented. Indeed, the list seems to have abandoned the nationalistic principles of the earlier note on range and content, as it includes 8 British authors across both columns. So while we may do well to be critical of the curriculum, we can also acknowledge that some attempt was made to recognize the vital roles that poetry and narrative can play in the lives of students, an attempt that can also be seen in the descriptions of the ideal college and career-ready student back on page 7. Many of those goals can be tied to Stephen Ellenwood's call for a return to character education in his article, Revisiting Character Education from McGuffey to Narratives. While the overall thrust of Ellenwood's argument seems quite conservative, he does begin with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. It nevertheless makes a credible case for why discussions of morals and ethics should be woven into the very fabric of literary pedagogy. In doing so, his argument sets itself not just against the policy-oriented proclamations of the Common Core documents, but also Terry Eagleton's fears of literature being used to inculcate empathy in readers. Ellenwood begins by recognizing a dichotomy in American education that has existed since the foundation of the first public schools. a dichotomy in which schools are either value-neutral institutions that steer clear of any discussion of belief, morals, or ethics, or they are inculcators of basic values, which were presumably shared by all Americans. Ellenwood then acknowledges a counterintuitive reality, that in spite of the perennial claims of reactionary groups bemoaning the decline in American values, there has long been a distrust of teaching morality in schools, precisely because of a deep-seated cultural fear of indoctrination and propaganda. Indeed, while basic principles of civic mindedness and the civil religion have been a common thread in American education, as Ellenwood's references to the quaint McGuffey Reader remind us, a formal discussion of teaching morals in the public classroom didn't really commence until the early 1970s and the values clarification movement. That early discussion emphasized a highly rational, even-handed approach to moral issues that might now be regarded as disturbingly relativistic. As Ellenwood points out, though, that movement was quickly displaced by the cognitive moral development movement, which was heavily indebted to the theories of the renowned child psychologist Jean Piaget. This movement was probably the high point of introducing character and moral education in the classroom, as it framed students' moral sense as simply one more faculty alongside their intellectual, physical, and emotional development that had to be nurtured by the educational institution. But as Ellenwood briefly lays out, moral issues, because of their interdependence with shifting social relationships, cannot be lesson planned in the same way as multiplication tables, book reviews, or even self-esteem exercises, which is why character education was largely abandoned by the late 20th century, at least at the macro-curricular level. This is why Ellenwood calls for a revival of such educational practices, particularly in the literature classroom. He singles out literature because prior attempts at moral education encouraged looking at moral situations in a straightforward, logico-scientific way. By contrast, he claims complex moral problems require narrative thinking, which is enmeshed with people and events, with time and place. Ellenwood's argument delineates and articulates a position that many people usually subscribe to, but in vague terms, namely, that the literature classroom is the place where most people can expect to have their moral values both challenged and sharpened. Whether it is talking about religious intolerance in the context of Paradise Lost, sexual mores in Pride and Prejudice, or racism in Huckleberry Finn, even the most structurally involved, new critically inclined literature classrooms must touch on real-world moral problems.